The day was bright and clear and the hall was buzzing with people. It wasn't just any hall. It was a massive, elegantly decorated space filled with flowers, glittering chandeliers, and soft golden lights that reflected off polished floors. Guests were dressed in their finest attire, talking in quiet murmurs while sipping champagne and coffee. This wasn't just a party, it was a ceremony, one that would celebrate the life and achievements of a man who had been one of the richest and most influential people in the country. Everyone knew the billionaire's story. He had built an empire from nothing, starting with a small business and turning it into a global phenomenon. People admired him, envied him, and some feared him. Even though he had passed away only a few months ago, his presence was felt everywhere. In the media, in conversations, and in the eyes of those who had worked with him. And now his family had gathered to honor him, to give speeches, to remember him in the way that people of great wealth and influence often remembered their loved ones, with grand gestures, careful words, and a certain public performance that showed both respect and prestige. Among the crowd, the billionaire's family stood at the front. The widow looked composed, though those close to her knew she had spent countless sleepless nights since her husband's passing. She wore a long, dark dress, simple but elegant, and her hands were folded gently in front of her. Beside her, the late billionaire's son stood quietly. He was young, maybe not older than 8 or 9, with dark, curious eyes and a small frame that somehow made him seem even smaller in the vast hall. He wasn't just any child. He was the son of one of the wealthiest people in the country, and in the weeks since his father's death, he had been the quiet center of attention at family gatherings and private meetings. Despite his young age, the boy had a certain presence. He didn't fidget or cry. He didn't seem nervous. Instead, he watched everything with sharp, thoughtful eyes, taking in the people, the speeches, the flowers, and the cameras that were quietly recording the event. The child seemed aware that everyone expected him to behave in a certain way, to be quiet, to look sad, and to step aside while the adults handled the serious matters. And at first, that's exactly what he did. He stood near his mother, hands folded politely, nodding when someone spoke to him, smiling politely when people complimented his attire, but otherwise remaining still. The ceremony began formally. A speaker took the stage, a well-known figure in the business world, and began to recount the billionaire's achievements. The speech was full of carefully chosen words, highlighting the man's intelligence, his work ethic, his generosity, and his influence. Guests nodded along, some whispering to each other, some taking notes, others recording videos for social media. The atmosphere was both respectful and heavy, as if everyone was trying to balance grief with admiration. But then something unusual happened. The little boy who had been standing quietly beside his mother suddenly moved forward. At first, people thought he was simply walking to a better spot to see the stage. But then, he stepped onto the small platform where the speaker was standing and raised his hand slightly, as if asking for attention. The room fell into a sudden silence. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Cameras shifted, journalists leaned forward, and even the speaker paused mid-sentence, surprised. No one had expected a child to speak at this ceremony. It wasn't part of the plan. There had been no announcement. The boy's mother looked startled, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder, but he shook it off, stepping forward with a seriousness that belied his age. His voice when he began to speak was calm and clear, not shy or hesitant, but filled with determination. "I want to say something about my father," he said. The words were simple, but in the stillness of the hall they carried weight. Everyone turned to look at him, unsure what a child could possibly have to say that would be relevant to such an important ceremony. "People are saying many things about him," the boy continued. "Some say he gave everything to his companies. Some say he gave everything to charity. But I know something that no one is talking about." There was a brief murmur in the audience, a mixture of curiosity and confusion. Adults exchanged glances, unsure how to respond. The boy's mother stepped forward again, but he held up his small hand to stop her. He seemed determined not to be interrupted. "I want everyone to know the truth," he said. "My father wanted some things to be private, but I think it's important that people hear them. He wanted to make sure the people who loved him and worked with him knew certain things. I am here to say them." The hall was silent now, not a whisper, not a cough. The cameras zoomed in. Guests leaned forward in their seats. Even the most serious business people, used to controlling every situation, seemed taken aback. It was not every day that a child interrupted a formal event and demanded attention in such a commanding way. The little boy took a deep breath, his small chest rising and falling. Then slowly he began to speak about the man he had known best, his father. He spoke of the late billionaire's work, yes, but he also spoke of the man behind the empire, the moments when he had been kind, when he had been unfair, and when he had made choices that no one else could understand. His words were honest, simple, and heartfelt. They painted a picture of a man who was both larger than life and deeply human. "You think he was only about money," the boy said, his voice carrying across the room. "But he cared about people. He cared about his friends, and he cared about me. He wanted things done in a certain way, but he also wanted people to be happy. And that is why I am here." The audience was silent, hanging on his words. Some people had tears in their eyes. Others were shocked by the boldness of a child speaking so openly in a formal setting. Even those who had come expecting a typical, polished, and controlled ceremony found themselves captivated by the sincerity of this young voice. For the first time in the ceremony, the atmosphere shifted. It was no longer about pomp or prestige. It was no longer about speeches that praised the man in abstract terms. Instead, it had become personal, real, human. The audience realized that the billionaire's life wasn't just about money, or power, or public image. It was about the connections he had made, the choices he had kept private, and the legacy he had left behind for the people who mattered most to him. The little boy paused, and in that moment, everyone held their breath. They were waiting almost instinctively for the next words, unsure what he would reveal. The tension was a mix of anticipation and respect. No one wanted to interrupt. Even the media crew, trained to capture breaking news, seemed hesitant, sensing that this was something rare, a moment where a child's perspective could change the way everyone understood a powerful man. He looked around the room, eyes landing briefly on each section of guests, and then spoke with quiet authority. "Some things are not fair," he said. "Some people might think my father left only some people happy. But that is not true. He had reasons for everything he did. I know because he told me. And I want everyone to know that some things are not what they seem." A few adults shifted in their seats, whispering to each other. The boy's words were carefully chosen, simple but powerful. He wasn't accusing anyone or making wild claims. He wasn't causing chaos for the sake of it. He was speaking truthfully from the heart about the man he had known best. And that was enough to change the tone of the ceremony entirely. By the time he finished speaking, the hall was quiet, but the silence was heavy with thought. People were no longer simply attending a ceremony. They were reflecting. They were considering the life of the man they had known from headlines, but also from stories shared by a child who had seen a side no one else had. It was rare to hear such honesty, and rarer still to hear it delivered with courage by someone so young. As he stepped down from the platform, some guests applauded softly, while others remained silent, processing the moment. The child's mother gathered him in a gentle hug, her eyes moist but her face proud. She knew that her son had done something extraordinary, something that would be remembered for a long time. And as the ceremony slowly resumed, the little boy's words lingered in the air, reminding everyone that behind the fortune, the fame, and the power, there was a person who had loved, struggled, and tried to do what he thought was right. In that quiet moment, the ceremony had changed. It was no longer just about remembering a billionaire's achievements. It was about remembering the humanity behind those achievements, seen through the eyes of a child who was brave enough to speak the truth. The silence in the hall after the boy's first words was thick, almost electric. People didn't know how to react. Some looked at each other with wide eyes, whispering quietly, afraid to break the moment. Others just stared at the child, trying to understand how someone so young could speak with such confidence. It wasn't just his words, it was the honesty, the way he seemed to see things clearly, as if he understood matters that even adults struggled to grasp. The speaker on stage, who had been ready with rehearsed words and a carefully structured speech, looked stunned. He wasn't used to being interrupted, especially not by a child. He stepped back slightly, unsure whether to continue, apologize, or wait. But the boy's voice didn't falter. Instead, he took a small step forward, his little shoes clicking softly on the polished floor, and spoke louder this time, making sure everyone could hear. "My father had rules for everything," the boy said, his tone serious. "Some people think they know what he wanted. Some people think he left some things secret for no reason. But I know why, and I want everyone to know too. The room grew even quieter. Guests leaned forward in their seats, some gripping their programs tightly, others holding their drinks a little too tightly. Even the journalists, trained to stay composed no matter what happened, seemed caught off guard. A few were whispering to their cameras, reminding each other to stay ready. But the cameras themselves were already rolling, focused entirely on the boy. The boy paused and took a breath. His small chest rose and fell rapidly, showing just a hint of nervousness, but he didn't stop. He looked around the room, scanning the crowd with eyes that seemed to understand more than anyone expected. "Some people in our family think that only money matters," he said softly, yet with a firm edge. "But my father taught me that truth matters more. And some truths are hard to say. I want to say them now." For a moment, the crowd was frozen. The adults who had grown used to controlling situations suddenly felt out of control. The media crews, used to chasing scandals or polished interviews, were witnessing something raw, something unfiltered. This wasn't part of the script. There were no speeches, no prepared statements, no polished messages. There was just a child speaking what he believed, a mixture of innocence, honesty, and courage. The little boy then took a step closer to the microphone, leaning slightly so his small voice could be heard. "My father worked hard," he said. "He gave money to people, to companies, to charities. But he also kept secrets. Some of these secrets were for safety. Some were for people he loved. Some were because he wanted to make sure people would think carefully before making decisions." A few heads in the audience nodded, quietly acknowledging that even adults sometimes kept secrets for the right reasons. But others looked confused, unsure what exactly the boy was trying to say. Was this a message about money? About family? About something else entirely? He continued, his words deliberate and measured. "He told me about the people who helped him when no one else would. He told me about the people he trusted most, and he told me that one day I would understand some of the choices he made. Today I want to share a small part of that." The crowd leaned in closer. Even those who had attended countless ceremonies and events felt a strange mix of respect and suspense. A child, barely taller than the stage's first step, was commanding the attention of a room full of adults who had been trained to be in charge of every conversation. "My father wanted people to know that not everything is what it seems," the boy said, looking directly at the audience. "Sometimes people see the money and the power and they think that is all there is. But it isn't." He cared about fairness. He cared about honesty. He cared about people. The journalists, sensing that a major revelation was about to happen, adjusted their cameras and microphones. The little boy's mother stepped closer, gently resting her hand on his back, but he didn't stop. He seemed to know that this was his moment to speak the truth as he understood it. "I know some of you think that my father's fortune was only for the people everyone talks about," the boy continued. "I know some of you think only adults matter when it comes to money. But I know the truth, and I think it is important that everyone hears it." The room fell completely silent. Even the staff, who were used to handling unexpected events, froze in place. No one wanted to interrupt. No one wanted to ask questions. Everyone waited, realizing that this small boy was about to say something that could change how people understood everything they had thought about the billionaire. Then he paused again, and for a moment it seemed like the boy was gathering his courage. His voice softened slightly, but the impact of his words did not fade. "My father didn't just leave things for the rich or for people who worked with him," he said. "He left things for the people who mattered quietly, the people who were loyal and kind when no one noticed. He wanted them to know that their actions mattered more than money. And he wanted me to tell you that, even though I am small, I will." The audience shifted in their seats. Some people were surprised by the maturity in his words. Some were emotional, realizing that a child was delivering a message of fairness and truth that many adults often forgot. The journalists whispered to each other, trying to figure out how to report this moment accurately. This wasn't just a story about inheritance or wealth. It was a story about honesty, integrity, and the human side of someone everyone thought they fully understood. The little boy took a deep breath and looked directly at his mother. She smiled faintly, encouraging him without saying a word. He then turned back to the crowd and continued. "Some people think that children don't understand big things like money or business. But I do. I understand more than people think. And I want to make sure everyone knows that my father cared about more than just money. He cared about truth. He cared about fairness. He cared about love. At that moment, a few of the adults began to nod slowly. They realized that this child was speaking truths that were often forgotten in the pursuit of wealth or success. Even in a room full of powerful and experienced people, the words of a young boy were cutting through the noise, reminding everyone of the humanity behind the headlines and balance sheets. "My father wanted people to be honest," the boy said. "He wanted people to help others when they could. He wanted people to remember that being kind is more important than being rich, and he asked me to remind you all of that." The atmosphere in the hall shifted completely. Where there had been formal speeches and polite applause, there was now a deep, reflective silence. People weren't just listening, they were thinking. They were imagining the billionaire as the boy described him, a man who had influence and wealth but also deep care for people and fairness. The boy paused for a final moment, his small chest rising and falling, before speaking the words that would define the rest of the ceremony. "And I want everyone to know that even though my father is gone, his message is still here, and I will make sure it is never forgotten." Some guests quietly wiped their eyes. Some whispered to each other, acknowledging the wisdom coming from someone so young. Even the adults who had been skeptical or critical of the family felt a shift inside them. The child had reminded everyone of something simple, yet powerful: that truth and kindness are more important than money, fame, or control. When the boy finally stepped down from the small stage, the crowd erupted, not in wild cheering, but in thoughtful, appreciative applause. People were clapping for courage, for honesty, for the rare and unexpected clarity that only a child could provide. The boy returned to his mother's side, her arms wrapping around him tightly. She whispered a few words of encouragement, and he smiled softly, a little shy, but proud of what he had accomplished. Even after the applause died down, the energy in the room had changed. Conversations that had once been about wealth, power, and strategy now centered on fairness, legacy, and truth. People were no longer simply attending a ceremony. They were reflecting on what had just happened, and on the message a small boy had delivered in his own words. For the journalists and media crews, the story was clear. This was no ordinary event. This was a moment when a child, unexpectedly and courageously, reminded everyone of the human side of life, wealth, and family. For the guests, it was a moment they would remember for years. For the family, it was proof that even in the face of loss, the right words spoken from the heart could inspire and touch everyone in the room. And as the ceremony slowly continued, with speeches now feeling lighter and more genuine, the little boy stayed quietly at his mother's side, observing, listening, and knowing that he had done something important, something that would change the way people remembered his father, not just as a billionaire, but as a man who cared deeply about the people around him and the values he wanted to pass on. The room had barely returned to normal after the boy's speech about his father's values, when a quiet tension began to settle over the audience. People were still talking in low whispers, their attention pulled between the formal proceedings and the words of the child who had just stolen the show. Even the media crews were holding back, sensing that something else was coming. The little boy had promised a truth, something that no one had expected, something that would shake the ceremony in a way no one could ignore. The boy stood next to his mother, small hands folded, but there was a determination in his eyes that made it clear he wasn't finished. He looked out at the audience, scanning the faces with an intensity that made everyone suddenly aware of him. The room fell silent again. People shifted in their seats, unsure of what to expect. Some were excited, curious to hear what a child of his age could possibly know. Others were nervous, wondering if he was about to say something inappropriate or upsetting. "I have something more to say," he began, his voice calm but steady. "Something my father wanted everyone to know, but he didn't tell anyone because he thought people might not understand. I understand, and I think it's important that everyone hears it." The murmurs stopped. The guests leaned forward, some gripping the edges of their chairs, all eyes on him. There was a stillness that felt almost sacred, as if the air itself had paused to listen. Even the adults who had attended hundreds of events found themselves holding their breath. The little boy was about to reveal something significant, something the billionaire had kept private, and it felt like a story about power, influence, and money was about to become a story about truth and humanity. My father had a plan," the boy said, his small voice carrying clearly across the hall. "Not just for our family, not just for his companies, not just for the people everyone sees on television or in magazines. He had a plan for people who no one talks about. People who work hard quietly. People who are loyal without asking for rewards. People who do good even when no one notices. The audience exchanged glances. Some nodded slowly, beginning to understand the depth of what he was saying. Others looked puzzled, unsure how a child could know such things. The journalists adjusted their cameras, leaning in, knowing they were capturing something rare. The little boy paused for a moment, looking directly at his mother and then back at the audience. He left instructions, he said, his tone more serious now. Instructions for things that are not in the papers, things that are not in the headlines. He wanted people to be fair. He wanted people to know the truth. He wanted me to tell everyone that sometimes the most important things are not the things you see. A few people shifted in their seats, whispering quietly. The words were simple, but they carried weight. The boy wasn't just talking about wealth or business. He was talking about fairness, honesty, and the kind of human values that even adults often overlook in the pursuit of money or fame. I know some people think my father only cared about himself, about his fortune, or about what people would say about him, the boy continued. But I know differently. I know he cared about people he loved and people who worked hard quietly. And he left something for them. Something important. Something he wanted me to share today. The audience leaned in closer, the anticipation growing. The little boy's mother reached out, but he gently shook his head. He wanted to do this on his own, and in that moment it was clear that he understood the responsibility he had been given. He was speaking for his father not just as a child, but as someone who had been trusted with a secret that could change how people remembered a man who had seemed larger than life. The boy took a deep breath and lowered his voice slightly, drawing the audience in. He wanted people to know that money is not everything. He wanted people to understand that loyalty, kindness, and honesty are worth more than wealth. But he also wanted people to know that he had made mistakes, and he wanted me to tell the truth about them. A quiet gasp went through the room. People weren't expecting this. The child was talking about mistakes, about honesty, and about revealing something that had been hidden. The air was charged with tension. Even the adults who had thought they understood the billionaire were suddenly unsure. What could this child know that had not already been spoken of in countless speeches, interviews, and biographies? My father, he trusted the wrong people sometimes, the boy said, his voice firm. He gave opportunities to people who didn't deserve them. He believed in people who weren't honest. And because of that, some things went wrong. Some people got hurt. And he felt sorry about that. He wanted everyone to know that it wasn't because he didn't care, but because he tried to see the good in everyone. The crowd was silent, absorbing every word. It wasn't just a confession, it was a revelation. The little boy was telling a story that no adult speaker could have delivered with the same impact. It was raw, human, and unexpectedly powerful. People were starting to see the billionaire not as a distant, untouchable figure, but as someone real, someone who made decisions, faced consequences, and felt deeply for the people around him. And there is one more thing, the boy said, pausing to let the words sink in, something he wanted only a few people to know. Something he asked me to share today because he wanted everyone to understand. He wanted to make sure that some people who were struggling, people who had no voice, would get a chance to have a better life. He left instructions so that money, help, and opportunities would reach them. People who never expected it. People no one talks about. People who needed it most. The audience shifted in their seats again. A few people whispered to their neighbors, trying to process what they had just heard. The little boy's words weren't just about mistakes or honesty. They were about compassion, about hidden generosity, and about using wealth to help people who were often overlooked. The revelation was subtle, but it hit harder than any headline could. The boy's mother reached out again, gently resting her hand on his shoulder, and he smiled softly at her, a mixture of shyness and pride. He wanted people to know that being rich is not just about enjoying life, he said. It's about helping others. And he asked me to remind everyone that what you do quietly matters more than what you show to the world. He wanted people to remember that even small acts of kindness are important. For the first time, a few tears appeared in the audience. People were touched, not just by the generosity the boy described, but by the honesty and courage it took for a child to speak these words in front of so many adults. The billionaire, who had seemed untouchable and powerful, was now seen through the lens of compassion, mistakes, and responsibility. and it was the voice of a child that had brought this to light. "Some people will remember him for the money he had," the boy continued. "Some will remember him for the companies he built. But I will remember him for the lessons he gave me, and I want everyone to remember that being kind, honest, and fair is more important than being rich." He wanted everyone to know that it's not just about wealth. It's about what you do with it. The room was completely silent now. Even those who had been skeptical or critical of the family were moved. There was no applause yet, no chatter, just a shared understanding that they had witnessed something extraordinary. A child had revealed the hidden truth behind a man who had seemed untouchable, and in doing so, had reminded everyone of what truly mattered. The little boy looked around the room one final time. "I know I am small," he said softly, "but my father trusted me to tell the truth, and I hope everyone will remember it. The people who are kind, the people who are honest, the people who try to do good, even if no one notices, they are the ones who matter." That is what my father wanted everyone to know. As he finished speaking, the audience erupted, not in wild cheering, but in deep, thoughtful applause. People were standing, some wiping tears, some nodding slowly. The energy in the room had shifted completely. The ceremony was no longer just about celebrating wealth or status. It had become a celebration of values, of hidden truths, and of a legacy that went far beyond money. The boy returned to his mother's side, and she wrapped her arms around him tightly, whispering words of pride and encouragement. He smiled shyly, looking around at the crowd, knowing that he had delivered his father's message exactly as he had been asked. Even the journalists, who had come expecting a standard ceremony, were now scribbling notes furiously. This was no ordinary story. This was the story of a child revealing a hidden truth, reminding the world of the human side of a man everyone thought they knew, and showing that courage and honesty can come from the most unexpected places. As the ceremony slowly resumed, with speeches continuing but now feeling lighter and more genuine, the little boy stayed quietly at his mother's side. But everyone knew that what he had said would be remembered for years. He had revealed the truth, shown the humanity behind wealth, and reminded everyone that the most important things in life are not always visible. And in that moment, it was clear that the billionaire's legacy was not just in the fortune he left behind, but in the lessons he passed on to his son, and through him to everyone in that hall. The room remained quiet for a few moments after the boy's words sank in. The audience wasn't just listening, they were processing. People shifted in their seats, exchanging looks of surprise, awe, and quiet reflection. What had started as a formal ceremonial event had transformed into something far more profound. The little boy had done more than speak. He had opened a door to a truth that no one expected. The guests, who had come dressed in fine suits and gowns, used to exchanging polite smiles and small talk, were now silent, their faces reflecting genuine emotion. Some covered their mouths with their hands, trying to hold back tears. Others leaned forward in their chairs as if by moving closer they could better absorb the meaning of his words. Even the media crew, cameras rolling, stopped making notes and focused entirely on capturing the emotion in the room. The boy's mother held him gently, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder, trying to offer comfort without interrupting the flow of his courage. She glanced at the crowd, sensing the profound effect her son's words were having. She could see it in the faces around her. The surprise, the humility, the recognition that the little boy had spoken truths that many adults had forgotten. Several of the family's closest advisors, who had been standing near the stage, exchanged silent glances. They had prepared speeches, prepared lists, and carefully curated statements to guide the ceremony. None of it mattered now. A child had taken control of the narrative, and everyone in the room realized that this wasn't just about money or inheritance. It was about the human side of the story. Some guests began to whisper softly to each other. "Did you hear that?" He knew. He really knew what his father wanted. Can a child really understand this much? Those words. They hit harder than any speech I've ever heard. Even the journalists, who had long ago learned to keep emotion out of their work, were quietly impressed. One of them lowered a camera slightly, muttering, "It's like he's telling the story of the man behind the headlines." Notes were still being taken, but with far more care, as if recording not just facts, but the essence of a moment that could not easily be captured. The little boy looked around the hall again, sensing the effect of his words. For a child, he seemed unusually aware of the adult reactions, the slow nods, the glistening eyes, the reflective silence. He understood that the audience wasn't just hearing his father's values, they were feeling them. He had spoken about fairness, honesty, and compassion, and it had landed in the hearts of everyone present. A few of the older guests, people who had grown up around business deals and negotiations, felt a strange mix of nostalgia and remorse. They remembered times when they had focused solely on wealth, on power, on appearances, forgetting the small human actions that truly mattered. And now, sitting in a large hall, they realized a child had reminded them of what they had lost sight of. Slowly, the whispers began to grow into murmurs of agreement. He's right. It's not just about money. Kindness, loyalty. That's what matters. The things we don't see, the small acts, they count more than we realize. The little boy's mother gently squeezed his shoulder, giving him a quiet nod of encouragement. He had already shared the shocking truth, revealing how his father had cared for people quietly, rewarded loyalty, and tried to help those who had no voice. But now, as he stood there, he realized that the impact of his words was rippling across the room like water in a pond. The silence had transformed into reflection, and reflection was turning into understanding. One of the family's business partners, a person who had always been seen as stern and unapproachable, whispered to a colleague next to him, "I never thought of him that way. I never thought about the quiet generosity, the care behind the decisions." His colleague nodded, eyes fixed on the boy, realizing that even in a room filled with adults and power, a child had reminded them of the deeper meaning behind their work and their lives. The audience's reaction became more visible. People began standing slowly, some clapping lightly, not out of celebration, but out of respect. The applause was soft at first, hesitant, as if they weren't sure if it was appropriate. Then it grew, spreading across the room, until it became a collective recognition of courage and truth. It wasn't applause for wealth or position. It was applause for honesty, for integrity, for a child speaking what many adults could not. A few people quietly wiped tears from their eyes. One woman, seated near the front, whispered to the person next to her, "He's speaking for all of us. He's reminding us what matters." The other nodded, unable to find words, simply listening to the boy and feeling the weight of his message. Even the senior executives, who had spent decades negotiating deals and managing empires, felt a subtle shift inside them. The ceremony had been meant to celebrate success, but it had become a reflection on legacy. They were no longer just thinking about financial growth or influence. They were thinking about the meaning of their actions and how small acts of honesty, kindness, and loyalty could define their lives far more than any contract or portfolio. The little boy looked out again, his small hands clasped together, sensing that the audience was beginning to understand. He didn't need to speak loudly. He didn't need to repeat himself. The truth had landed. He had told of his father's intentions, of the quiet generosity, the mistakes acknowledged, and the message of fairness, and the audience had received it, each in their own way, but all with a newfound awareness. Some of the younger guests, who had been raised with the idea that wealth and success were the ultimate goals, felt a gentle but powerful lesson settling in their hearts. They realized that the little boy's words weren't just about his father, they were about life itself, about what really mattered when all the money, power, and recognition faded away. It was about kindness. It was about honesty. It was about remembering the people who often went unnoticed. Even outside the immediate circle, the ripple effect of the boy's words began to spread. Staff members who had been quietly serving refreshments and managing the event felt a sense of pride. They had witnessed something rare, a child speaking, truth with courage, reminding everyone in the room of values that mattered far more than any ceremony or accolade. The boy's mother, holding him gently, felt a swell of pride and relief. She had known he had the courage, but seeing the effect on the adults around him filled her heart with something indescribable. She knew that this moment, and the message he had delivered, would be remembered not just by the family, but by everyone in that hall, and it might even inspire them to make changes, to consider their actions, and to focus on what truly mattered in life. Several guests quietly approached the boy afterward, offering smiles, nods, and soft words of admiration. "You spoke so well," one whispered. "You reminded us what's important," another added. "Thank you for sharing the truth. It was powerful." The boy nodded politely, a shy smile on his face, but he felt proud. He had delivered his father's message exactly as intended, and he had touched the hearts of many people in the room. The media crews, sensing the moment's significance, began interviewing the adults who had been deeply moved. "Did you expect a child to speak with such understanding?" one reporter asked a senior executive. The executive shook his head, eyes still reflecting the impact. "No, I didn't. But it's a reminder that truth and kindness are timeless. It doesn't matter how old you are, courage can come from anyone." As the ceremony continued, there was a noticeable difference in the mood. Speeches felt more genuine, the atmosphere more reflective. People were listening with more attention, speaking with more care, and thinking about the lessons that the boy had delivered. Even the formal structure of the event, which had seemed rigid and distant before, now felt human, connected, and meaningful. The little boy remained quietly by his mother's side, observing, listening, and understanding that his words had created a lasting effect. It wasn't about applause or recognition. It was about making people pause, reflect, and consider the deeper meaning behind actions and wealth. And in doing so, he had accomplished something remarkable. He had reminded a room full of adults of the values that truly mattered in life. By the end of the ceremony, as guests began to leave, conversations shifted from the usual formalities to heartfelt discussions about honesty, fairness, and human kindness. The boy had sparked a ripple effect that would linger long after the event ended. People were talking, reflecting, and thinking differently, not just about the billionaire's legacy, but about their own actions, their own lives, and the way they treated the people around them. And in that moment, it was clear that the true legacy of the billionaire wasn't just in wealth or property. It was in the lessons he had taught his son, the courage of a child to speak truth, and the reminder that even small acts of kindness and honesty can change the world. As the ceremony drew to a close, the atmosphere in the hall had shifted completely. The formalities that had seemed so important earlier, ribbon-cutting, speeches, handshakes, now felt secondary. People were no longer focused on appearances or protocol. Instead, their thoughts lingered on the little boy and the words he had spoken. The truth he had shared, the honesty and insight he had shown, had left an impression deeper than any award, any gift, or any announcement could. Guests slowly began to stand and gather their things, but conversations were quieter, more thoughtful. Many people lingered near the stage, talking in small groups about what they had just witnessed. It wasn't just a story about a billionaire's fortune anymore. It was a story about legacy, responsibility, and the power of speaking the truth. People were discussing not the wealth or status of the family, but the message that kindness, honesty, and fairness mattered more than anything else. The little boy stood beside his mother, holding her hand tightly. He had returned to a quiet, calm presence, no longer the center of the ceremony's attention, but still carrying the impact of his words with him. He looked around at the adults, the journalists, the staff, and even the audience members who had been skeptical at first. He could see the effect he had created. Their faces showed reflection, thoughtfulness, and a kind of humility that can only come when people are reminded of truths they have overlooked. His mother leaned down and whispered to him, "You did exactly what your father asked. You told the truth and you touched their hearts." The boy nodded quietly, his small smile shy but satisfied. He didn't need applause or recognition. The reaction of the audience, the way they had paused and reflected, was enough. He felt proud, not because of himself, but because he had honored his father's wishes. As people began to leave the hall, many lingered near the exit, speaking in hushed tones. Staff members who had been quietly managing the event shared their own reactions. "I've never seen a child speak with so much wisdom," one said. "He reminded us what really matters in life." Another added, "It wasn't just a speech, it was a lesson, and I think we'll all carry it with us for a long time." Outside the hall, the air felt different. People were still talking, Still reflecting on the event, and the story of the little boy spread quickly. Journalists were already drafting articles, not just about the billionaire's legacy, but about the courage and insight of his young son. Social media posts began to circulate, highlighting the speech, sharing quotes, and emphasizing the powerful message that even a child could deliver a truth that resonated with all ages. The boy and his mother left quietly, avoiding the media crowd as best they could. They walked through a side exit, and the mother squeezed her son's hand gently. "You were amazing," she said softly. "You reminded everyone that life isn't about what we have, but about what we do with what we have." The boy nodded, feeling the weight of her words, understanding that his actions had meaning beyond the ceremony, beyond the speeches, and beyond the wealth that surrounded his family. Later that evening, back at their home, the boy sat quietly in the living room while his mother prepared tea. The room was calm, filled with a quiet warmth. He reflected on the day, thinking about the faces he had seen, the reactions of the audience, and the way his words had landed. It felt strange, but also good. Strange because he was just a child, yet good because he had managed to share something important. His mother joined him, sitting down and handing him a cup of tea. "Do you know what you did today?" she asked gently. The boy shook his head. "I told them what my father wanted," he said simply. "I told them about fairness, kindness, and helping people, and I think they understood." She smiled, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Yes, you did more than just speak. You reminded adults, people who have been in business and life for decades, of what truly matters. You reminded them that wealth and power are not the most important things. You reminded them that kindness, honesty, and compassion are what leave a real mark on the world." The boy thought about it for a moment, then asked quietly, "Do you think my father would be proud?" His mother's eyes softened, and she nodded slowly. "Yes, he would be very proud. And not because of what you said alone, but because you understood him. You understood his heart, and you shared it with others. That is what he wanted more than anything." In the days that followed, the story of the little boy's speech continued to spread. News outlets covered the ceremony, but they didn't focus on the wealth of the family or the business deals. Instead, they highlighted the truth the child had shared, the honesty he had shown, and the message of compassion and integrity that had touched so many people. Social media users praised the boy's courage, and the video of his speech went viral, inspiring discussions about values, honesty, and the importance of helping others. Even within the family's circle, the effect was profound. Advisors, business partners, and employees began reflecting on their actions and decisions. Some started making changes, small but meaningful, in how they approached their work and treated others. The boy's message had reminded them that behind every contract, every business deal, and every decision, there were human lives affected. And that awareness, sparked by a child, was creating subtle but lasting change. The little boy himself continued to grow quietly, learning from his father's legacy and the reactions of those around him. He began to understand that his words had power, and that speaking the truth, even when it was difficult, could inspire change. He carried a sense of responsibility, not as a burden, but as a gift, a reminder that even young voices can have a profound impact. His mother often reflected on the moment too. She realized that her son's courage had not only honored his father's legacy, but had also reminded her of the importance of listening, understanding, and encouraging the voices of the next generation. She saw that children, even in their smallness, could teach adults lessons about truth, compassion, and humanity that were often forgotten in the hustle of life. In the weeks and months after the ceremony, people continued to talk about it. Conversations in boardrooms, family gatherings, and social events often returned to the little boy's words. People discussed how kindness, fairness, and quiet generosity mattered more than appearances or recognition. And even though some were skeptical at first, the sincerity and simplicity of the child's message won them over. It was not just a story. They felt its truth deep within. For the boy, life returned to normal in many ways. School, playtime, and everyday routines continued. But he carried with him the knowledge that he had made a difference, that he had honored his father's wishes, and that he had reminded adults of values they sometimes overlooked. He learned that courage and honesty could create ripples far beyond what one might expect, and that even a child's voice could leave a lasting legacy. One evening, as he sat reading quietly in his room, He thought about the day of the ceremony and the people he had spoken to. He remembered the faces, the silence, the applause, and the quiet conversations afterward. He realized that the lesson wasn't just for the adults, it was for him too. It was about understanding responsibility, caring for others, and knowing that even the smallest actions could matter greatly in the lives of those around him. His mother peeked into the room and smiled. "You know," she said softly, "your father's legacy isn't just the fortune he left behind. It's the lessons, the courage, and the kindness he passed to you. And today you shared all of that with the world." The boy looked up, his eyes bright with understanding, and nodded. He didn't need to say anything. He felt it in his heart. Months later, the family's foundation, inspired by the boy's speech, began implementing changes. Projects were directed to help the unnoticed, the quiet, and the struggling, people who had often been overlooked. The impact was subtle but meaningful, showing that the father's values, as shared by his son, could influence more than just words. They could inspire action, and in that way, the little boy's courage created a bridge between the world of wealth and the world of humanity. He reminded everyone that legacies were not measured solely by fortune or power, but by truth, kindness, and integrity. His words became a quiet force, shaping thoughts, inspiring actions, and leaving a mark that would last far longer than the ceremony itself. In the end, the story of the little boy and the shocking truth he revealed became more than an event. It became a lesson for all who witnessed it. A reminder that courage and honesty can come from the youngest voices, that legacy is about more than wealth, and that even in a world focused on success, kindness and fairness matter most. And the boy, small yet wise beyond his years, carried forward the message, knowing that speaking truth and living with integrity were the most powerful ways to honor the ones we love, and the ones who can no longer speak for themselves.